Volume 3, The Forge of Kings. We have come a long way, haven't we? From the damp mould of a flour barrel in the hold, across the frozen deserts, and drifting on deadly currents. Silas has lost everything, his innocence, his voice, and even his familiar enemies. But all roads lead to a single point. They say the Arctic is the coldest place on Earth. They were wrong. There is a heart beating beneath the ice. A heart of fire and iron. Welcome to Volume 3. This is no longer a story of survival. This is a story of legacy. The stone door has closed behind Silas. The only way out is through the fire. Hold on to your seats, because here, even the ice can burn. Chapter 16. The City of Ash. The tunnel was a throat, and it was swallowing them whole. Silas walked with his head down, shielding his eyes from the stinging sulphur smoke. The air was thick, hot, and tasted of metal. It was a violent contrast to the clean, sterile cold of the ice sheet they had just left. Behind him, Barnaby panted heavily. The heat was torture for the thick-coated sheepdog. Silas could hear the animal's claws clicking nervously on the smooth basalt floor. "Steady," Commodore Franklin whispered. The blind man was gripping Silas's shoulder with a bruising force. "Do not stumble, Lieutenant. Listen to the acoustics. We are no longer in a cave. We're in a hall." Franklin was right. The echoes of their footsteps had changed. They were no longer tight and claustrophobic. They were vast. And then there was the light. It wasn't the blue bioluminescence of the ice cavern. It was orange, angry, flickering, furnace orange. They stepped out of the tunnel. Silas stopped, his jaw locked. He had expected a cave, a camp. Maybe a few tents clustered around a vent. He was wrong. Spread out before them, inside a colossal volcanic caldera roofed by a dome of glacial ice, was a city. It was a nightmare of ingenuity. Structures were built into the walls of the crater, tiered like a Roman amphitheatre. But they weren't made of marble. They were made of wreckage. Ribs of whale ships formed the arches of doorways. Rusty iron plates from steam boilers paved the streets. Masts served as support pillars for precarious bridges that spanned the bubbling geothermal lake in the centre. And everywhere, there was steam. Pipes, bamboo-like tubes made of copper and hollowed bone snaked through the city, carrying heat to every hovel. "Describe it," Franklin demanded, shaking Silas's shoulder. "Tell me what we have found." Silas tapped Franklin's hand. "Ship." He guided Franklin's hand to point at the far wall of the caldera. Embedded in the rock, high above the city, was the stern of a ship. The gold lettering was still visible through the grime. The Archangel. The stern they had seen in the Ice Valley, Volume 2, was just the broken half. The rest of the ship, the heart of it, had been dragged here. "The Archangel," Franklin whispered, sensing Silas's intent. "So the Russians didn't crash. They arrived." "Move!" the watcher behind them barked. He shoved Silas with the butt of his spear. They were marched down a winding path toward the centre of the city. The inhabitants of this underworld stopped to watch them pass. They were a strange hybrid people. Some looked Inuit, with high cheekbones and dark skin. Others were pale, tall, with Slavic features. They wore clothes made of cured leather and woven metallic fibres. They didn't look starving. They looked strong, hardened by heat and labour. And they were all looking at Barnaby. "Dog," the child whispered, pointing. "Kimmick." They'd never seen a dog this size. Or perhaps they hadn't seen a dog in 50 years. The watchers led them to the centre of the lake. There, on an island of black rock surrounded by boiling water, stood the forge. It was a massive structure, built around the main volcanic vent. A giant bellows made from the stitched skins of 100 whales pumped air into a furnace that roared like a dragon. Clang, clang. A man was working at the anvil. He was a giant. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his torso bare, slick with sweat and soot. His skin was a map of burn scars. He wore a mask made of iron, a crude, industrial visor that covered his eyes and nose. He was holding a pair of tongs. In the tongs was a bar of white-hot metal. He raised a hammer, a sledgehammer that looked like a toy in his massive hand. Clang. Sparks flew, illuminating the cavern. The watchers stopped at the edge of the bridge. They bowed. "My king!" the leader of the watchers called out. "Outsiders! From the ice!" The giant didn't stop hammering. Clang. Clang. He shaped the metal. He folded it. He beat it. Finally, he plunged the hot steel into a vat of oil. Hiss! Steam exploded. The giant turned. He placed the hammer on the anvil. He wiped his hands on a rag. He walked toward them. The ground shook with his steps. He stopped 5 feet away. The heat radiating from him was intense. He looked at Franklin. He looked at the gold braid on the Commodore's uniform. "English," the giant rumbled. His voice was deep, tectonic. It sounded like stones grinding together. He spoke English with a heavy, archaic accent, Russian-tinged. "Lost," the giant said. He turned to Silas. He looked at the boy, at the stolen coat, at the hatchet, at the scar. Then he looked at the bone harpoon sticking out of Silas's pack. The giant's eyes, visible through the slits of his iron mask, narrowed. He reached out. Silas flinched, but he didn't move. The giant didn't take the harpoon. He touched the tip, the meteoric iron. "Star metal," the giant whispered. "You bring the sky iron home." He looked at the Watcher leader. "Where did you find them?" "The gate, Lord Volkov," the Watcher replied. "They carry the ancestors' weapon." "Volkov," Franklin gasped. "Volkov? The metallurgist? But that was 50 years ago. You cannot be him." The giant laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "I am Volkov III, the giant said. "We're all Volkov here. The blood does not change. Only the fire changes." He turned back to Silas. "You have walked the white hell," Volkov said. "You have crossed the grind, and you bring me metal." He gestured to the city around them. "Welcome to New St. Petersburg, or as the locals call it, the Cradle." He leaned in close to Silas. "But guests must pay a toll." He pointed to Barnaby. "The beast," Volkov said. "The tunnel rats are growing large. My cats are not enough. We need a hunter." Silas stepped in front of the dog. He shook his head. "No." Volkov straightened up. He towered over the boy. "You refuse the king?" Silas looked at the fire in the forge. Then he looked at Volkov. He tapped the hatchet at his belt. He didn't refuse. He negotiated. He pointed to Franklin, then to himself, then to the dog. "We are a pack. We stay together." Volkov stared at the mute boy. He saw the defiance. "A silent negotiator," Volkov mused. "Rare." He turned to the forge. "Very well, the dog stays with you. For now." He picked up the piece of metal he had just forged. It was a blade. A long, curved knife. "But you, boy," Volkov said, pointing the cooling blade at Silas. "You have hands. You have anger. I can see it." He threw the blade to Silas. Silas caught it by the handle. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. "The grind is coming," Volkov said, his voice darkening. "The ice is moving faster than ever. The roof of this world is cracking." He pointed up at the ice dome above the caldera. A massive crack ran through it, leaking steam. "We are building an ark," Volkov said. "An iron ark, one, to escape the collapse, to sail under the ice." He looked at Franklin. "We need a navigator." He looked at Silas. "And we need a diver." Silas frowned. "Diver?" Volkov pointed to the bubbling lake. "The star metal," Volkov whispered. "The source of the heat. It fell from the sky 1,000 years ago. It sits at the bottom of the lake. We need more of it to plate the hull, to make the ark strong enough to break the ice." He smiled behind his iron mask. "You brought a sliver." He pointed to the harpoon. "I need the meteorite." "You will dive," Volkov commanded. "Or you will burn." Whoosh! Silas looked at the boiling lake. He looked at the blind Commodore. He looked at his dog. He had escaped the water of the ocean only to find a new, hotter ocean waiting for him. He nodded. Volkov laughed. "Good. Feed them. Then bring the diving bell." The king's hospitality was a cell, but it was a warm cell. Silas, Franklin, and Barnaby were escorted to a hollowed-out chamber in the rock wall, overlooking the glowing lake. The door was a grate of iron bars, heavy and rusted. Inside, there were pallets of straw covered in caribou skins, a luxury compared to the ice. A watcher shoved a wooden bowl through the bars. "Eat," the guard grunted. "Fuel for the work?" Silas picked up the bowl. It contained a grey, gelatinous stew. It smelled of earth and mushrooms. He dipped a finger in and tasted it. Fungus, grown in the dark, damp caves. And meat, rat, or something else? Silas didn't ask. He ate. He scraped the bowl clean. His body, starved for weeks, absorbed the calories like a dry sponge absorbing water. He fed the chunks of mystery meat to Barnaby. The dog ate them without complaint. Commodore Franklin sat on his pallet, his blind eyes fixed on the distant glow of the forge outside. "Do you hear it, Lieutenant?" Franklin whispered. Silas tapped the floor. "What?" "The rhythm," Franklin said. "The hammers. They are not beating at random. They are synchronized. 1, 2, 1, 2. He leaned back, his face gaunt in the orange light. "It is the rhythm of a galley ship. Forced labour. This King Volkov. He is not a monarch. He is a warden." Franklin pointed a trembling finger toward the centre of the caldera, where a massive, dark shape was taking form in the shadows of the forge. "And that," Franklin said, "is not an ark. It is a monster." Silas walked to the bars. He looked out. In the flickering light, he saw the hull of the vessel Volkov was building. It was ugly, a long cigar-shaped tube made of riveted iron plates. It had no masts, no sails. Only a small conning tower and a propeller at the rear that looked like a giant screw. An iron whale. It was primitive, brutal, and terrifying. "A submersible," Franklin murmured. "I drew plans for one once, to sail beneath the ice packs. But to build one here, with scavenged iron and whale oil?" He shook his head. "It will be a tomb. If the pressure doesn't crush it, the air will run out." Silas looked at the iron whale. Then he looked at the boiling lake. The heat was rising. The crack in the ice dome above was widening. Crack, boom. Dust and ice crystals rained down onto the city. The hammering stopped for a second. The people looked up. Then the hammering resumed. Faster. Desperate. The door to their cell clanked open. 2 watchers entered. They didn't look at Franklin. They looked at Silas. "The king waits," the guard said. "The bell is ready." Silas stood up. He tightened his belt. He patted Barnaby's head. "Stay," he signalled. The dog growled, stepping between Silas and the guards. Silas pushed the dog back gently. "I have to do this." He walked out. They led him down to the water's edge. The heat here was blistering. The water of the lake was bubbling, sending plumes of sulphurous steam into the air. Volkov was waiting on a wooden pier that jutted out into the lake. Beside him sat the machine, the diving bell. It wasn't a bell, it was a sphere. It was made of copper plates, green with oxidation, hammered together and sealed with pitch. It looked like a giant bruised eyeball. There was a small round window of thick glass, likely salvage from a ship's porthole, set into the front. And on top, a rubber hose, an air hose made from stitched intestines and canvas, connected the sphere to a crude hand-cranked pump on the pier. Volkov patted the copper hull. It rang like a gong. "The descent sphere," Volkov rumbled. "My grandfather designed it. I perfected it." He pointed to the lake. "The star metal is heavy. It sank to the deepest rift." 300 feet down. 300 feet. Silas looked at the hose. It looked fragile. The water down there, Volkov continued, is not boiling. The cold ocean seeps in from below, but the thermal vents create currents. Violent ones. He handed Silas a weighted belt. Lead bricks sewn into leather. Put it on. You need weight to sink. Silas strapped the heavy belt around his waist. He felt like he was putting on his own anchor. Volkov handed him a tool. A pair of iron tongs, similar to the blacksmith's, but with a rope attached. Find the glowing stones, Volkov commanded. Grab them. Pull the signal rope twice. We haul them up, then we haul you up. He leaned in close, his iron mask reflecting the orange firelight. Do not try to stay down. The air in the sphere lasts 20 minutes. After that, he shrugged. You sleep? Silas looked at the sphere. It was a coffin, a copper coffin that would be lowered into hell. But he looked up at the ceiling. The ice was groaning. The grind was coming. If they stayed in the city, they would be crushed. If he dove, they might get the metal to fix the ark. They might escape. It was a choice between a fast death and a slow one. Silas climbed into the sphere. Inside, it was cramped. The air smelled of stale copper and fear. There was a small wooden bench. Silas sat down. His knees touched his chest. He looked out of the thick glass porthole. He saw Volkov's distorted face peering in. Bring me the stars, boy, Volkov said. Then, the hatch was slammed shut. Clang. Screech! The silence inside was sudden and absolute. Then, the sound of the air pump began. Hiss. Hiss. Silas felt the sphere lift. He swung in the air for a moment. Through the porthole, he saw the city of fire, the giant Volkov, and the distant figure of Barnaby barking on the shore. Then, the sphere dropped. Splash. The orange light vanished. Silas sank into the boiling green soup. The bubbles roared past the window. The light faded from orange to murky green, and then to black. He was descending, deeper. The heat outside the copper walls began to fade and replaced by a creeping cold. The metal groaned under the pressure. Creak. Silas gripped the tongs. He stared into the darkness. He was the Leviathan now, or the bait. Chapter 17. The Abyss Gazes Back. The world shrank to a copper sphere, 5 feet in diameter. Silas sat huddled on the narrow wooden bench, his knees drawn up to his chin. The air inside was thick, smelling of old rubber and the terrified sweat of previous occupants. Above him, the air hose hissed rhythmically. Hiss, clunk, hiss, clunk. It was the heartbeat of the surface. As long as that sound continued, he was connected to the world of men. If it stopped, he would be just another fossil in the sediment. He looked down. Volkov's descent sphere was essentially a primitive diving bell. The floor wasn't solid metal. It had a circular opening in the centre, a moon pool about 2 feet wide. Because of the air pressure pumped from above, the water didn't flood the sphere. It stayed level with the rim of the hole, a dark, trembling mirror at Silas's feet. Through this hole, he had to work. He peered into the water. Green turned to grey. Grey turned to black. The heat was stifling at first, residual from the surface. But as the chain rattled and lowered him deeper, the copper walls began to cool. Condensation formed on the rivets, dripping onto Silas's neck like cold fingers. Drip. Drip. He counted the seconds. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The pressure began to build. He felt it in his ears, a sharp, squeezing pain. He swallowed hard, popping his ears. Pop! The metal sphere groaned. Crack, groan. It sounded like the sphere was being crushed by a giant hand. A rivet popped somewhere near the top, pinging like a bullet. Ping! Silas flinched. He gripped the iron tongs Volkov had given him. They were long, heavy scavenger's tools. Suddenly, the descent stopped. The sphere swayed gently, suspended in the dark. Silas leaned over the moon pool. He lowered the lantern Volkov had provided, a chemical lamp enclosed in thick glass. He lowered it on a string through the water at his feet. The light cut through the murk. He gasped. He was hovering about 5 feet above the bottom of the lake. It wasn't mud. It wasn't rock. It was a boneyard. The floor of the rift was littered with white shapes. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, human bones, hundreds of them. Volkov hadn't just used guests for this. He had used generations of labour. This wasn't a mine, it was a mass grave, and scattered among the bones were the stones, star metal. They were jagged, black rocks, about the size of coconuts. They didn't glow, but the water around them shimmered, distorting the light like heat haze. Radiation, magnetism. Silas swallowed his fear. He had a job. He reached down with the long tongs. He dipped them into the icy black water of the moon pool. The cold bit his hand instantly, even through the glove. He aimed for a large chunk of metal resting inside a rib cage. Clack. He gripped the stone. It was heavy, dense. He hauled it up. He pulled the dripping black rock into the sphere and dropped it into the canvas sack at his feet. 1. He went back for another. He grabbed a second stone. 2. He reached for a third. This one was partially buried in the silt. He tugged. The silt billowed up, clouding the water. Something moved in the cloud. Silas froze. A shape slithered through the lantern light below. Long, pale, serpentine. It was thick as a man's thigh. An eel? No. It had legs. Tiny, translucent legs. A giant isopod. A mutated worm. The tunnel rats Volkov spoke of. The creature circled the area below the sphere. It was blind, sensing the vibration. It bumped against the hanging lantern. The lantern swung wildly, casting erratic shadows inside the sphere. Silas pulled the tongs back. He held his breath. The creature rose. It came up toward the moon pool, toward the air pocket, toward the heat of the boy. A head emerged from the water at Silas's feet. It was a nightmare. A pale, bulbous head with no eyes, just a ring of sensory whiskers. And a mouth, a circular mouth filled with rows of rasping teeth. A lamprey, a giant, blind, thermal lamprey. It hissed. A wet, sucking sound. Uck. It lunged. It didn't bite Silas. It latched onto the canvas sack, the sack holding the star metal. It smelled the minerals, or maybe the leather of the bag. It clamped its jaw onto the sack and pulled. Silas grabbed the other end of the sack. A tug of war in a copper coffin. "Let go," Silas screamed silently. The lamprey was strong. It thrashed, its slimy body slapping against the copper walls. Water splashed everywhere. Silas kicked the creature. His boots slid off the mucus-covered skin. The lamprey dragged the sack toward the hole. If it pulled the sack down, Silas lost the metal. If he lost the metal, Volkov would kill Barnaby. Silas grabbed the hatchet from his belt. He didn't have room to swing. He stabbed. He drove the hatchet blade down into the creature's neck, or where a neck should be. Thwack! The lamprey shrieked, a high-pitched vibration that rattled Silas's teeth. Black blood sprayed the inside of the sphere. It let go of the sack. It thrashed wildly, its tail whipping Silas across the face. Then it dropped back through the moon pool. Silas fell back against the bench, gasping. He was covered in slime and black blood. He looked at the moon pool. The water was churning. More shapes were rising, and the blood was attracting them. He grabbed the signal rope, the rope running up through the air hose, and he yanked it. 1, 2, 3. "Pull!" he begged. "Pull me up!" For a second, nothing happened. Then, the sphere jerked. Clank, whir, the ascent began. But something slammed into the bottom of the sphere. Bang, another lamprey, trying to get in. Bang, bang. They were swarming. Silas huddled on the bench, clutching the sack of star metal, his feet pulled up high to avoid the snapping jaws rising from the hole. The water level in the moon pool fluctuated violently as the pressure changed. The air grew thin, the pump sound seemed to get slower. Hiss, pause, hiss. Silas felt the darkness closing in, not from the outside, but from his own mind. The nitrogen narcosis, the lack of oxygen. He looked at the star metal in the sack. The black rocks were beginning to A faint violet glow pulsed from the cracks in the stone, and in his head he heard a voice. Not Franklin's, not Volkov's, a whisper. Free us? Silas shook his head. Who are you? We are the fuel. Free us. The sphere broke the surface. Splash. Orange light flooded the moon pool. The air hose stopped hissing. The hatch bolts were unscrewed. Screech! Fresh, sulphurous air rushed in. Volkov's giant face appeared in the opening. You live, Volkov grunted, sounding disappointed. Do you have it? Silas threw the sack out of the hatch. It landed with a heavy clank. He climbed out. He collapsed on the wooden pier, shaking, covered in slime. Barnaby ran to him, licking the black blood off his face. Volkov opened the sack. He picked up a stone. He ignored the hum. He ignored the violet pulse. Good, Volkov said. Pure starlight. He looked at Silas. You have paid the toll, boy, for today. He turned to the watchers. Take the metal to the forge. Prepare the hull. He looked back at Silas. Clean yourself. Tomorrow, we weld. Silas lay on the pier. He watched Volkov walk away with the sack. He heard the whisper again in his head. Faint. Fading. The fire is a prison? Silas looked at Franklin, who was waiting by the cell door. The blind man looked terrified. What is it? Franklin whispered as Silas approached. You smell of ancient things. Silas took Franklin's hand. He tapped one word in Morse code which Franklin had taught him on the ice. ALIVE. But Silas knew the truth. The stones weren't just metal. They were something else. And Volkov was building a ship out of them. The washroom was a cavern fed by a cooler spring. Silas stood naked under a stream of tepid water, scrubbing his skin raw with a rough block of pumice. The black slime from the lamprey didn't want to leave him. It clung like oil, smelling of ancient, rotted fish. But it was the feeling he couldn't wash off. The vibration. Even now, safely on solid rock, his bones hummed. It was a low-frequency resonance, like standing next to a church organ pipe. The star metal had left a ghost in his marrow. Free us, the voice echoed in the dripping water. Silas stopped scrubbing. He looked at his hands. Under the grime, his skin looked paler, almost translucent in the dim phosphorescent light of the fungi on the walls. He dressed quickly in his damp clothes. He put on the captain's coat. It felt heavier now. Or maybe he was just weaker. He walked back to the holding cell. Barnaby was waiting at the bars, wagging his tail. But Franklin was pacing. The blind Commodore was moving back and forth in the small cell, his cane tapping a frantic code on the stone floor. Click, click, tap. Click, click, tap. You're back, Franklin whispered as Silas entered. The old man reached out, grabbing Silas's wrist. He didn't check for a pulse. He checked the temperature. You are cold, Franklin muttered, but the air around you, it prickles. Static electricity. Franklin pulled Silas to the corner of the cell away from the watcher guard dozing by the door. Tell me, Franklin hissed. The stones, did they speak? Silas froze. How could he know? Silas took Franklin's hand. He traced a question mark on the palm. I felt it, Franklin said, his voice trembling. When Volkov walked past with the sack, it is not just iron, boy. It is magnetite infused with something else. Something biological. Franklin lowered his voice to a whisper barely audible over the distant roar of the forge. In the Royal Society, there were theories. meteorites that carry the seeds of life, or the seeds of madness. We thought the lead in the tins drove my crew mad, but perhaps we dug too deep in the ice. Perhaps we found this. He pointed toward the forge. Volkov is not building a ship. Silas? He's building a golem. He's trying to animate dead iron with living rock. Silas looked out through the bars. In the center of the lake, the activity had reached a fever pitch. Volkov was at the main crucible. He wasn't using the hammer anymore. He was using a ladle. He was pouring molten star metal. It didn't flow like orange lava. It flowed purple, a dark violet colour. And when it hit the iron plates of the submersible's hull, it didn't just cool and harden, it spread. Silas watched in horror. The violet liquid moved like veins, branching out across the rusted iron skin of the ark. It hissed, eating into the rust, bonding with the base metal. The ship shuddered. It looked like the ship was shivering. "He's infecting the hull," Franklin whispered, listening to the sound. "He's making it harder than diamond. But at what cost?" Volkov stood on the scaffolding, laughing. He raised his arms, conducting the flow of the metal like a maestro. "Grow!" Volkov roared. "Grow, my Leviathan!" The watchers on the ground fell to their knees, chanting. Silas felt a chill go down his spine. Volkov wasn't just a king, he was a cult leader, and his god was the meteorite. And Silas. Silas was the retriever, the high priest's errand boy. He looked at Barnaby. The dog was staring at the violet light, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Animals knew. This was against nature. Silas sat down on the straw pallet. He pulled the Russian map, out of his pocket. He smoothed it out. He traced the coastline, the cradle, the forge, and then the exit. The map showed a subterranean river flowing out of the caldera, leading under the ice shelf and emptying into the open ocean miles away. This was the path Volkov intended for his ark, but it was also the only way out for them. They couldn't go back through the gate, the watchers guarded it. They couldn't climb the caldera walls, too steep, too hot. They had to take the river, but to take the river, they needed a boat. Silas looked at the ark. It was the only boat. He looked at Franklin. The old man was muttering prayers in Latin. Silas tapped Franklin's knee. Franklin stopped. Silas took the Commodore's hand. He spelled out a word, S-T-E-A-L. Franklin frowned. "Steal?" Silas spelled again. S-H-I-P? Franklin gasped. "You want to steal that? That abomination?" Silas squeezed Franklin's hand. "Yes." "You are mad," Franklin whispered. "It requires a crew of 10. We are a cripple, a mute, and a dog." Silas placed the hatchet in Franklin's hand. He closed the old man's fingers around the handle. "We are enough." Franklin held the weapon. He felt the cold steel. He listened to the mad laughter of Volkov outside. "Perhaps," Franklin murmured, "perhaps madness is the only weapon we have left." He handed the hatchet back. "But first," Franklin said, his mind shifting into tactical mode, "we need to know how to pilot it. And we need to wait for the launch." He pointed his blind face toward the ceiling. "The grind is almost here. When the roof cracks, Volkov will launch. In the chaos, we strike." Silas nodded in the dark. He lay back on the straw. He watched the violet shadows dance on the rock ceiling. The hum in his bones was still there. "Free us." "I will," Silas thought. "I will free us all." He closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He waited for the roof of the world to fall. Chapter 18. The Iron Belly. The Forge of Kings was dying. Above the caldera, the ice dome was screaming. The grind had reached the roof. Massive cracks, glowing blue with filtered sunlight, zigzagged across the glacial ceiling like lightning bolts frozen in time. Chunks of ice the size of carriages rained down into the boiling lake, exploding into steam upon impact, Boom! Hiss! Panic had infected the city. The watchers weren't watching the prisoners anymore. They were running. They were loading crates of food, tools, and weapons onto the pier. Volkov stood on the deck of his iron ark, roaring orders, his voice amplified by a brass megaphone. "Load the coal, load the oil, the sky falls in 1 hour in the cell." Commodore Franklin stood by the bars, his head tilted back. 1 hour, Franklin corrected. Maybe less. The acoustics suggest the structural integrity is at 10%. He grabbed Silas's arm. "Now, Lieutenant. While chaos is their master, go." Silas looked at Barnaby. The dog was cowering under the straw pallet, terrified by the thunderous noise of the falling ice. "Stay," Silas signalled. He couldn't take the dog. Not for this. He squeezed through the gap in the bars that he had been loosening for the last hour with the star metal tongs, which he had hidden under his coat. The iron of the cage was old. The leverage of the alien metal snapped the rusted bolt. Silas slipped out. He was a shadow in the smoke. He moved along the crater wall, keeping to the darkness behind the shanty houses. The air was choked with ash and fear. He reached the pier. The activity was frantic. Men were carrying heavy sacks of coal up a gangplank into the belly of the ark. Silas waited for a cloud of steam from a bursting vent to obscure the gangplank. Whoosh! He moved. He didn't walk up the plank like a stevedore. He slid down the piling into the water, staying on the shallow, cooler edge of the pier, and grabbed the anchor chain hanging from the ark's bow. He climbed the chain. The metal was warm, vibrating with the violet energy of the star metal infusion. He pulled himself up to a horse hole. He squeezed through. He was inside. The interior of the ark was a claustrophobic nightmare. It wasn't built like a ship. It was built like a boiler. The walls were curved, lined with rivets that sweated oil. The heat was suffocating, dry, metallic heat that tasted of ozone. And the light. There were no lanterns. The light came from the walls themselves. The violet veins of star metal that Volkov had poured into the hull were glowing faintly, pulsating like arteries. Thrum, thrum. The ship felt alive. Silas crept forward. He was in the chain locker. He moved aft toward the engine room. The corridors were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. Pipes hissed overhead, dripping hot grease. He heard voices ahead. 2 engineers, men in heavy leather aprons, were arguing over a valve. "Pressure is too high," one shouted in Russian. "The seals will burst." "The king says push it," the other replied. "More coal." They moved past Silas's hiding spot, a dark alcove behind a steam pipe. Silas moved on. He reached the engine room. He peered through a grate. It was a cathedral of power. A massive steam engine sat in the centre, its piston size of tree trunks driving a central shaft. But the furnace wasn't burning just coal. Silas saw the stokers shoveling black rocks into the firebox. Star metal. They were mixing the meteorite with the coal. The fire inside the furnace wasn't orange. It was a blinding radioactive violet. The star metal acted as a super catalyst. It made the fire burn hotter than hell itself. Madness, Silas thought. The radiation will kill them all before they reach the ocean. But the engine wasn't his target. He needed the brain. He moved up a ladder, climbing toward the conning tower. The control room, it was empty for the moment. Volkov was still on the deck, screaming orders. Silas slipped inside. It was a small circular room lined with brass gauges and levers. Periscopes hung from the ceiling like stalactites. In the centre was the helm, a large iron wheel, and next to it, the ballast control. Silas studied the levers. They were labelled in Cyrillic, Russian. Pogrezhenie, dive. Visplyti, surface. Franklin had taught him the basics of Russian naval terms during their long trek, in exaggerated detail, but let's assume Silas recognises the mechanics rather than the words. He saw a large red lever locked with a pin. Emergency blow. This was it. This was how they surfaced. Silas needed to memorise the layout. He pulled a piece of charcoal from his pocket and sketched the panel on his palm. Suddenly, the hatch above clanged open. "Clear the bridge," Volkov's voice boomed. He was coming down. Silas looked around. There was no other exit. He scrambled. He dove into the only hiding place available, a small crawl space beneath the chart table. He curled up. Holding his breath, Volkov's heavy boots hit the deck metal. Clang, clang. The giant walked to the helm. He was breathing heavily, a sound like a broken bellows. "My beauty," Volkov whispered, stroking the wheel. "My iron eater." He wasn't alone. Another pair of feet followed, lighter steps. The watcher leader. "My lord," the watcher said. "The prisoners. Shall we leave them in the cell? The roof will crush them." Silas stopped breathing. His hand gripped the hatchet handle. Volkov laughed. "No," Volkov rumbled. "The blind man is a navigator. He has the stars in his head. Bring him." "And the boy? And the dog?" Volkov paused. He tapped a gauge on the panel. "The boy is a diver, useful. But the dog?" Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. "The dog is meat," Volkov said. "Throw it in the furnace. The star metal likes blood." Silas felt the world turn red. The hatchet in his hand trembled. He wanted to burst out. He wanted to swing. But Volkov was 7 feet of muscle and iron. Silas would die, and Barnaby would die. "Prepare for launch," Volkov commanded. "Bring them! Now!" Volkov turned and climbed back up the ladder. The watcher followed. The hatch slammed shut. Silas scrambled out from under the table. He had minutes. They were coming for Franklin. They were coming to burn Barnaby. He had to get back to the cell. He had to set the ambush. He ran. He didn't sneak this time. He sprinted through the corridors, sliding down ladders, dodging steam jets. He reached the horse hole. He threw himself out, sliding down the anchor chain. He hit the water. It was scalding hot near the surface. He swam to the shore, ignoring the pain. He climbed up the rocks. The ceiling above gave a terrifying lurch. Krach! A massive stalactite of ice broke loose from the dome directly above the city. It fell. It smashed into a row of shanties near the forge. Boom! Dust and debris exploded. Screams erupted. In the chaos, Silas reached the cell. He slipped back through the broken bars. Barnaby licked his wet hand. Franklin turned, his face pale. "You along?" Franklin hissed. "They are coming." "I know," Silas thought. He grabbed the sack of star metal he had retrieved earlier, which Volkov had taken. But wait, Volkov took the main sack. Did Silas keep a piece? Or did he steal something else? Correction. Volkov took the sack in chapter 17. Silas looked around the cell. He needed a weapon. A distraction. He remembered Franklin's chronometer detonator. The bomb mechanism. And he remembered the bag of black powder the watchers had left on a crate nearby, careless in their panic. Silas grabbed the powder through the bars. He poured it into the detonator casing. "What are you doing?" Franklin whispered. Hearing the granules. Silas placed the bomb in Franklin's hand. He guided the old man's thumb to the trigger. He tapped Franklin's palm. "Wait!" Boom! The sound of heavy boots approached the cell. The watchers were here to collect the navigator and the fuel. Silas stood in the centre of the cell. He put on his most terrified face, but behind his back, he held the hatchet. And in the corner, Franklin wound the spring of the detonator. Tick, tick, tick. The door opened. "Time to go," the watcher sneered. The watcher stepped into the cell. He held a coil of rope and a heavy iron collar, the kind used for dogs or slaves. "The blind man first," the watcher grunted to his partner behind him. "Then the beast." He reached for Franklin. Franklin didn't flinch. He stood straight, clutching the brass device in his hand. His thumb hovered over the release lever. "You're mistaken," Franklin said, his voice calm amidst the apocalypse thundering outside. "We are not fuel," the watcher frowned. "What?" Franklin smiled, a cold naval officer's smile. "We are the spark." He pressed the lever. Crack! Boom. It wasn't a grenade. It was a black powder charge packed into a brass tube. The concussive force was contained, but the sound and the flash were blinding. The cell turned white. Smoke filled the air instantly. The lead watcher screamed, clutching his eyes. He stumbled back, crashing into his partner. Silas moved. He didn't need to see. He knew where the target was. He swung the hatchet low. Crunch. The lead watcher went down, howling. Silas grabbed Franklin's coat. He slapped his thigh for Barnaby. They rushed the door. The second guard was coughing, waving his spear blindly in the smoke. He thrust the weapon forward. The tip grazed Silas's ribs, tearing the captain's coat but missing the flesh. Barnaby attacked. The dog launched himself at the guard's arm, biting deep into the fur and leather. The guard dropped the spear. Silas didn't stop to finish him. He shoved the guard aside. "Run!" Silas signalled. "No." He grabbed Franklin's hand and pulled. They burst out of the cell block into the main cavern. The world was ending. The ceiling had given way. The crack was no longer a line. It was a gaping mouth. A waterfall of ice and freezing ocean water was beginning to pour into the magma lake. Hiss, roar. Steam exploded upward, creating a blinding fog. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing cold water meeting boiling hot lava. "To the ship!" Franklin shouted, stumbling over debris. "Follow the sound of the engine." They ran toward the pier, but the path was blocked. A mob of terrified workers, the citizens of the Cradle, were surging toward the Ark. They were screaming, begging to be let on board. On the deck, Volkov stood like a demon. He held a steam rifle, a weapon connected to a backpack boiler. "Back!" Volkov roared. "Only the chosen! Back!" He fired. Jets of scalding steam cut through the crowd. The people fell back, terrified. Volkov turned to his crew. "Cut the lines! Launch! Now!" The gangplank began to rise. The heavy mooring ropes were slashed with axes. The Ark was drifting away from the pier. Silas, Franklin, and Barnaby reached the edge of the crowd. They were too late. The gap was already 10 feet, and widening. "We missed it," Franklin gasped, leaning on his cane. "It is over." Silas looked at the ship. He looked at the churning black water. He saw the stern, the rear of the submarine. It sat low in the water. And sticking out of the back near the propeller housing was a maintenance ladder, rungs welded to the hull. But to reach it, they had to jump, not from the pier, but from the crane. Above them, a wooden cargo crane swung wildly in the wind generated by the thermal updraft. Its hook dangled over the water, swaying toward the retreating ship. Silas pointed up. Franklin shook his head. "I cannot see to jump, boy." Silas didn't argue. He grabbed a coil of rope from a crate on the pier. He tied one end around his waist and the other around Franklin's waist. He grabbed Barnaby and shoved the dog inside his large coat, buttoning it tight. The dog's head poked out, eyes wide with terror. Silas climbed. He hauled himself and the stumbling blind man up the crane's wooden strut. They reached the arm of the crane. The Ark was passing underneath them. The propeller was starting to turn. Chug! Chug! The water churned white. "When I pull," Silas thought. He waited. He watched the stern pass below. The maintenance ladder was a small target. Silas grabbed Franklin. He wrapped his arms around the old man. He jumped. They fell 20 feet. They didn't hit the deck. They hit the side of the hull. Bam! Silas took the impact. The breath was knocked out of him. He slid down the wet iron skin of the ship. His hand clawed for purchase. His fingers found a rung. He hung there, dangling over the churning propeller wash. Franklin dangled below him, tied by the rope. Barnaby was squirming inside the coat. "Did we make it?" Franklin wheezed from below. Silas looked up. The propeller was thrashing just feet away. If they fell now, they would be minced meat. He gritted his teeth. He pulled. He hauled himself up to the next rung. Then he hauled the rope. Inch by inch, they climbed the ladder on the side of the moving submarine. They reached a small hatch near the rudder mechanism, the emergency maintenance access. Silas spun the wheel. It was stiff with rust. Crack! It opened. They tumbled inside just as the arc accelerated. They lay on the floor of a dark, oily compartment. The roar of the engine was deafening here. Outside, the cavern collapsed. Through the vibration of the hull, they felt the shockwave. The cradle was gone, buried under millions of tons of ice and rock. They were alive. But they were trapped in the belly of the beast. Silas sat up. He untied the rope. He let Barnaby out of the coat. The dog shook himself, sneezing coal dust. Franklin sat up, adjusting his tattered uniform. "We are aboard," Franklin whispered, "but we are in the steerage, the rudder room." He pointed to the massive hydraulic piston above them, moving back and forth, steering the ship. "Volkov is in the bow, we're in the stern. Between us is an army of fanatics." Silas checked his hatchet. The edge was chipped. He checked the star metal map in his pocket. He looked at the dark corridor leading forward. The hunt was no longer across the ice. It was room by room, corridor by corridor, and the prize was the helm. The cradle has fallen. The fire that sustained the City of Kings has been extinguished by the ice it tried to defy. Volkov believes he has escaped the apocalypse. He believes his iron ark is a vessel of salvation. But he doesn't know that the true danger is not the crushing depths outside, but the stowaway is breathing inside his walls. Silas, Franklin, and Barnaby are no longer prisoners. They are ghosts in the machine. The hunter has entered the belly of the beast, and he has brought his hatchet. The journey home has begun. But in the darkness of the subterranean river, who is the captain, and who is the prey? The final confrontation approaches. Prepare for the deep dive. Subscribe. Ring the bell. The story continues in Part 7.